Very, very glad to be here, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to meet with you today and talk about MadCap Flare and some of these features: single sourcing, multi-channel publishing, and collaborative authoring. It was hard to narrow it down, the list of what to talk about, but for me, when I started using Flare, those were kind of the big hitters for me. So I'm excited to be able to talk about these, and hopefully as we go through this, you'll have some thoughts and ideas about how Flare can work for you in your projects, and how you can get value from what Flare has to offer. Now I want to start talking just a little bit about my own background and my own Flare story. So I've been in tech comm for about 13 years, which is pretty much my whole career. I've had various stints in other job roles. I was in project management for a time, and I was a business analyst for a period of time working with a support center and that sort of thing. But really my career has been built around technical communication, and that's what I love to do. And I've worked in a variety of different tech comm teams and roles. I started out as a junior member of a large tech writing team at a big corporation. And I've been in roles where I was a sole tech writer at a small startup, and pretty much anything you can imagine in between. I've also written for a big variety of audiences, people as technical as data center administrators and software developers, to as non-technical as old-time Idaho potato farmers, and that's not an exaggeration. So I've had a good variety of tech comm experience. I've seen a lot of different situations, a lot of different problems, and a lot of creative solutions to those problems. That said, I only started using Flare about a year and a half ago, so I'm relatively new to the Flare world. When I started using Flare, I had a kind of a challenging project ahead of me, and I got into Flare in large part because of my friendship and my Flare mentor with, his name's Paul Pearson. Some of you, of course, have heard of him. He really introduced me to Flare and helped me get started in it. But I was very surprised and thrilled, really, with the way that Flare solved the problems that I had always faced as a technical communicator, particularly real single sourcing and multi-channel output, and there are others, but those for me were kind of the big hitters. And I loved Flare because it put me, as the technical writer, in the driver's seat. It gave me the flexibility that I needed and that I wanted to be able to deliver the output to my audience that worked for them, and I didn't feel restricted in what I could and couldn't do based on what the tool offered and didn't offer. So I currently run my own company, Right Degree Communications. We provide contract technical writing and MadCap Flare consulting services. It's been a lot of fun and a great learning experience. So that's how I initially got started into Flare. Now, what we're going to talk about today, again, I had a hard time kind of narrowing down the topics to discuss with only 1 hour, but this is what I decided ultimately to go into. We're going to talk about single sourcing, specifically condition tags, snippets, snippet conditions, variables, and multiple TOCs. To some of you, these of course probably mean something. To others of you, they may not, if you're really brand new to MadCap Flare. So we're going to go into these and see what they are and give you an idea of how they work so that you can start to envision how you may be able to use them in your own projects. I'm going to touch on multi-channel output and what that means and how to use it, and we're going to go through a couple of collaborative authoring options that Flare offers, specifically the MadCap Contributor product, and I'm going to talk about source control. As you know, the title suggests, this course is intended for people who are new to Flare, maybe people who have never heard of it before and want to learn about it, people who are new to tech comm, maybe people who have been in technical communication for a while and have heard others talk about Flare but haven't ever seen it or haven't ever used it and are just curious. Maybe some of you who are just now diving in and getting started with Flare. You're the people I had in mind when I created this presentation. I'm sure hopefully more experienced users will also get some value out of this. But it was the newbie that was my intended audience as I created this. So let's dive in and get started. Now, unfortunately, I think I have to start with some boring stuff, which is some definitions of terms that I'm going to be using. We simply have to be on the same page with some of these terms that I'm going to be throwing around if you're going to be able to understand, I think, and get what we're talking about. The first, as simple as it may seem, is the word topic. A topic in Flare is simply a file that contains content and that you add to the TOC in Flare. In Flare, topics use the .htm extension, and we're going to look at that here in just a minute. I've seen Flare projects with as few as just a few topics, and seen Flare projects that have thousands. They are really the backbone of the project. They are the content, the text, the images, the videos if you're going to use them, the hyperlinks. This is the stuff that people come to your project to get to, is the actual content. A TOC, now there's several different definitions for a TOC. Of course, I think most people think of a table of contents in like the front of a book. That's not exactly what I'll be talking about when I refer to a TOC. In Flare, a TOC is an actual file, and it specifies which topics should be included in your output, and it defines the topic hierarchy. Again, we're going to look at this here in just a minute. And the third term that I want to make sure I clarify is the term target. A target in Flare is an instance of an output type. So targets are what you actually build to compile or generate publishable output. And I want to try to describe this a little bit better. Give me just a second here. So I want to just walk through real quick and show you these three different things that I've just talked about in Flare itself. So I've got Flare open right now. Up here in my Content Explorer, you see just a bunch of these, .htm files. These are topics. These are the files that contain the information and the content that people use to complete whatever task they're trying to complete. If I open one of these up, I think this one has some dummy content in it. Yep, it does. You'll see it's just what you would expect to see, just some text. This one doesn't have any images or anything like that. It's got some lists. You can include hyperlinks. Pretty straightforward. I think most of us are comfortable and understand what a topic is. One really cool thing about Flare, if I drag this open, is I can get a side-by-side WYSIWYG view and a code view. This is part of what I mean when I said Flare puts me in the driver's seat, as I have access to this code and can get in and see what's really going on. So here are a list of topics. These are in no particular order in my Content Explorer. I have some of them in this tutorials folder. That doesn't make a difference really. It's just there for me to be able to organize things and to envision and keep things in order for myself. Let me open up now, my TOC. As I mentioned, this is the file where I actually build my structure for my project. So I've already kind of put this together. All you would do, and I'll just give you an example here, is you would take your topic and you could just drag it over and put it in your TOC, and then you could, adjust the hierarchy however you need to, move files up, down, left, right, that sort of thing. And you can see this looks like a normal sort of table of contents that you would imagine seeing. I don't have to put all of my topics in there. I can just put a few if I want. It doesn't really matter. But this is where I put the topics that I want included in my generated output, and where I define the hierarchy on how they relate to each other. Now, let me open up the final file type that I want to talk about, which is a target. A target, like I said, represents a publishable output format. You can think of it as sort of I guess sort of like a funnel. And that's where you take all of your content, all of your other conditions, variables, anything that you have in your project, your style sheets, and it all comes together at the target. And when you build the target, here's the build button right here, when you build it, it takes all of your source content and generates a publishable output that you can use, whether it's a website or a PDF or whatever it may be. You'll see here as part of your target, you specify which TOC you want the target to use. There's a drop-down list. I have only one TOC in this project, so only one is listed. If I had 2 or 3, I would see those listed here. So that is how topics relate to the TOC, which relates to the target. Again, I'm going to be using the terms topic, TOCs, targets fairly regularly throughout this presentation. So I wanted to kind of give a level set there so that you have a vision of what I'm talking about when I use those terms. I realize that you may not have a full grasp of them. I certainly didn't when I was new, but now I think you at least sort of understand how those three relate to each other and how they interact. With each other. So let's dive in here. Let's get started talking about single sourcing. First of all, what is single sourcing? Quite simply, single sourcing is the practice of reusing content throughout your documentation deliverable. Write once and use it as many times as you want. Why do you want to use single sourcing? Well, there's a host of reasons why. I've listed a few here. For me, it really decreases the authoring time because, like I said, I write something once and I can reuse it as many times in as many places as I want. It significantly reduces the likelihood for error because you're not having to go to multiple different places to make updates. If you, for example, have had to copy and paste, a paragraph in 5 different documents, and all of a sudden that paragraph needs an update, in Flare you only go to one place, and you can update that in all of your locations. And it really, really simplifies ongoing maintenance. Now I could go on and on about other benefits of single sourcing. For me, these ones are some of the big ones. How do you actually do it? Well, in Flare, there are so many single sourcing features, and they can be used in, it seems like, an endless number of ways, very creative and innovative ways to meet your needs. The ones I'm going to discuss today are condition tags, snippets, snippet conditions, variables, TOCs, and targets. And I hope as I go through this, again, you can kind of start to envision how you might be able to use these in your own project. Now, I'll need to apologize a little bit up front. I've used quite a few animations in this presentation here. I typically am averse to animations in PowerPoint slides, but as I was putting this together, I realized that there was some value in this case in using them to help describe how these features work in Flare. With that said, I also built them such a way that if you look at this presentation after the fact in non-presentation mode, you'll be able to follow the pictures that I'm going to show very easily. So in Flare, you can tag any content or any topic with your own conditions. You define these conditions. And then you can specify whether that condition, the content that is tagged with that condition, should publish in any given target. So let me walk through an example here. I'm going to be using a lot of examples today, and every example that I talk about is a real example that I've used or encountered in one of my own projects or working with a client. This one's a pretty simple, straightforward one. There's a company that develops a product, and it has 2 different models. There's Model A and there's Model B of this particular product, and they want 2 different help systems for each model. They don't want to mix and mingle them together because they're worried that'll confuse the user. In Flare, the first thing I would do is I would create a condition tag set. I would create a condition tag for Model A, and I would create one for Model B. After I had done that, I can go through and I can start tagging files in my TOC. I've represented that here in the top part of this box. Each gray box represents a topic that is common to both Model A and Model B. The green box here represents a topic that is specific to Model A, and the blue boxes represent topics that are specific to Model B, mapping back here to these conditions. I can also tag content within files themselves, as I've shown here in the lower part of this box. Again, the gray content is common content between both models, and then the colored content is content that is specific to the different models. I can use condition tags to tag anything I want in Flare. I can tag whole files like you've seen here. I can tag individual letters in a file. I can tag a row of a table or a column of a table, an image. Anything you can imagine, you can add a condition tag to it. Once you've added all those conditions, you create and you build your targets. In this case, because I have two different models, I'm going to have two different targets. In my target for Model A, I'm going to tell it to include content that is tagged with the Model A condition and exclude content that's tagged with the Model B condition. And of course, in my Model B target, it's going to be exactly the opposite. Let's exclude Model A and include Model B. When I build these targets, I'm going to end up with two help systems. Model A, of course, includes only common content and that content which was tagged with the Model A condition. And Model B will include exactly the opposite, the common content plus the content that was tagged with the Model B condition. Now, as I put this presentation together, in the interest of presenting as much information as I could and as many concepts as I could, I opted not to dive into the Flare interface itself to show you how to actually do this in Flare. With that said, I realized that eventually you have to get to that. You have to know how to do this stuff beyond just understanding it conceptually. So what I've done in the presentation is I've included videos here. Let me see if I can turn that off. That you can go watch after the fact. You can play these videos, and it's essentially just a screencast of showing exactly how to do the steps that I just discussed in the slide above. I'm not going to go through these here in this presentation, but if you download the presentation from the MadCap website after this, you can dive in there and you can go see how to actually do those steps that I just showed you. Again, my focus on this in this presentation for the newbies is to start giving you ideas and a vision of how you can use Flare in your own projects. All right, so that's condition. So let's move on to the next single sourcing topic, which is snippets. Snippets are, well, they can be pretty much anything you want. Typically, in my experience, they're pieces of content that are between a sentence and multiple paragraphs in length. And what you do is you create a snippet file, and then you can include that snippet file wherever you want in your topics. So in this example, we had a set of identical steps that needed to be included in multiple procedures. So we started by creating the snippet file itself. Like I mentioned, in this case, it was a procedure. It very easily could have just been a paragraph. It could have been an image. It could have been whatever I wanted it to be, whatever it needed to be. But in this case, it was 3 steps that were identical, and the customer needed these 3 steps in a lot of different procedures that they were writing. So we created one snippet file, and then we inserted that snippet file into our applicable source files or our applicable topics. So you can see in this example, I've put it into 3 different topics. Same file, wrote the content once, and then just inserted it into these 3 different topics. Then when I build my target, I end up with, of course, this content in my 3 different topics. In the first case, it's steps 1, 2, and 3. In the second, it's also steps 1, 2, and 3. And in topic 3, it was steps 2, 3, and 4 is how this particular thing worked out. Now you can see, coming back to ongoing maintenance, as I mentioned before, when we needed to change this, these steps, I went back and I changed it in one place, right here, and I perpetuated all the way through into everywhere where I had included the snippet. And that also, of course, decreases authoring time. You write it once and you use it in multiple places. Again, I've included a video on how to do these steps in Flare. We're not going to go through that now, but you can review that after the fact when you download the presentation. The next one is Snippet Conditions. So we talked about conditions, then we talked about snippets, now we're into Snippet Conditions. If you remember when we talked about conditions, we included or excluded content at the target level. The big difference between conditions and snippet conditions is that snippet conditions allow you to add conditions to snippets and then include or exclude them include or exclude the content at the topic level rather than at the target level. I'll be honest, it took me a while to figure out why I would use this or how I would use snippet conditions. And then just a few months ago, I had a client who hired me to write an SDK programming guide. They wanted one guide, but they wanted to include both an iOS and an Android section. They didn't want a separate iOS guide and a separate Android guide. They wanted one guide with the content in it separated into different sections within the guide. So this meant I had one TOC. This presented a very interesting situation because most of the conceptual content between the iOS and the Android information was identical, but all of the procedures were different on how you actually did the programming for the different platforms there. So what I did is I went and I created a snippet, just like what we did in the previous slide, just created a snippet. In this particular case, I put all the common content there in the snippet, and then I included the steps, as I see represented there by the red and the green boxes, the iOS steps and the Android steps. And in the snippet itself, I tagged the iOS steps using the iOS condition, and I tagged the Android steps using the Android condition. So when you open up that snippet, you see all of this information. You see all the common content, you see all the iOS specific content, and you see all the Android specific content. After I've developed the snippet, I inserted this snippet into both of the applicable topics. There's an iOS topic and there's an Android topic, and they both received the same snippet. And as you can see, at this point, there's a problem because my iOS has Android content and my Android has iOS content, and I need to get it down to where it's specific to the platform. So at that point, what I did is I applied the snippet conditions to the topics themselves. So I went into my Content Explorer, opened up the file properties, and in the iOS example, I set Android to exclude and iOS to include, and of course just the opposite for Android. That way, when I build my single target with one TOC for this SDK guide, in my iOS file, I only got the common content in the iOS stuff, and exactly opposite in my Android. I only got the common content and the Android stuff. And so that followed through using snippet conditions. I was able to set the conditions there at the topic level rather than at the target level. Now you may be asking yourself, couldn't I have just done this with snippets? Meaning putting the common content into snippets and then including the common content as snippets in my files. And the answer is, yeah, I could. That would have worked. But in this particular case, the files were such that it was much easier for me to keep all of the content together in one snippet with the information in that snippet tagged, rather than to kind of do the reverse where I put the common content into snippets. But using snippets would have worked. It was just in this case it was easier to do it this way. So when I got into this and realized what my client wanted, that's the first time I had used snippet conditions. I use them much more regularly now that I kind of know how to use them and the circumstances in which I would want to use them. Very, very helpful feature. Okay, Still with single sourcing here, let's move on and talk about variables. Variables are very similar to snippets in concept, but they're typically quite shorter. They're usually only a word or two. They're very helpful for things like product names, interface terminology, trademark terms, support contact information, stuff like that that you want or need to be consistent throughout your documentation project, and things that also might change. I worked at a company where they seemed like they could never settle on what the product name was going to actually it wasn't the product name, it was the version. The version, they could never figure out what version they were going to use, and so it was very handy to be able to use something like a variable where I could create a variable for the version number, and everywhere in my topics where I needed to reference the version number, I used the variable. That way when they decided the version number would be different, I just went back and changed it in one place, and it updated throughout all of my content. One thing that is really, really handy in Flare is that you can set your variable resolutions at the target level. So you don't have to. You can create a variable file and should, and actually have to create a variable file if you're going to use them for your whole project. But you can override what those variables resolve to in your target. Let me show you what I mean. So in this example, I've had to change some names up here, but there's a company and they have a series of amplifiers. The brand is Z Audio, and they sell a G2 and G4 product within this series. So they have a Z Audio G2 and a Z Audio G4. And they sell them in both the US and the UK. And they want support contact information in their documentation that is specific to the product. So by product I mean G2 or G4. So the first thing I did in Flare is I went and I created a variables file. I created a variable for the series, which resolves to Z Audio. That's the name of the series of amplifiers. That could change in the future. Plus I wanted to make sure that I was very consistent with it. So everywhere where I talk about Z Audio, I use the series variable. I created another variable for product, and you can see in the definition, I put target in all caps. That's not something you have to do, but what that says to me as an author is I need to make sure I go set that variable resolution in the target file and not necessarily here in the global variables file. And I did the same thing for phone. We're going to have a different phone number for the US and the UK. And so I in the global variables file, set the definition to target so that it would remind me to go change those when I needed to. I then inserted the variables into the applicable Flare source files. In this, it was like the support file, and all that it was one sentence. This is exactly what it looked like in Flare. Need more help with your, and then I included the series variable, which of course is going to resolve to Z Audio. Need more help with your Z Audio. And then right here I wanted the product. It should say either G2 or G4. But in my global variables file, I have it set to resolve to target. And so here it's just showing up as target. Again, a reminder that I need to go set that in the target. And then the same thing here. Need more help with your Z Audio, whatever it's going to be, contact us at this phone number. And again, a reminder that I need to go set that phone number in the target. So I wrote those two sentences one time, and I included them in the support.html file, one file, and in this particular project we had 4 targets. We had both we had a G2 target for the US and the UK and a G4 target for the US and the UK. I opened these targets, and let's start with this top target here. In the USG target, told the product to resolve to G2 and the phone to resolve to this number. Again, these two variables map back to what I have defined in my global variables file, product and phone. You see that here, product and phone. So when I build this target, it's going to come to this content, and it's going to start going through this, and it's going to realize it needs to pick up this variable here. It's going to realize, hey, that's not defined in the target. Let's go back to the global variables file and get the definition there. There it is. And then it's going to do the same thing for these other two variables, but it is going to recognize that they are defined in the target, and it's going to use what I specified in the target in place of these two variables. The output will be this sentence. Need more help with your Z-Audio G2? Contact us at this number. Now, of course, we also, moving on to the next target, sell this same product in the UK. And so in this case, I still have my product resolution set to G2 in my variable, but it's a different phone number. We have a different support center in the UK. So in this case, we get the same sentence, except it has the updated phone number for the UK. And we followed this same pattern for the G4 targets for both the US and the UK, and got the output that we needed for the support files for those help systems. So using variables, I was able to write this content just one time. Now, this is a very, very simple example, but I think you get the picture. Write it one time, and using these variables came up with 4 unique outputs that applied to the different, the different product lines and geographies that we, that we needed. It's very, very helpful. A really great feature to be able to define variable resolutions in the target. I've used that again and again and again in the projects that I've had to that I've worked on in the past 18 months or so. All right, finally, let's move on to multiple TOCs, another hugely helpful feature. So in Flare, you can create multiple TOCs. I don't know what the limit is, but I don't know if there even is a limit. I've worked with as many as probably 10 TOCs in my Flare project. Now remember, the TOC within the Flare context that we talked about 20 minutes ago or so, that file in Flare that defines what topics are to be included and the hierarchy of those topics. Well, when you have multiple TOCs, it allows you to reuse topics in your project to meet the demands for different audiences or different output requirements or whatever it is that you need. So in this example, my client wanted a simple getting started print guide, but a comprehensive HTML site that included all information. So the getting started print guide was essentially a stripped down version of what was included in the HTML site. So we started by authoring the content in Flare. We had all of our topics, the basic building block of any project. And then we, created 2 TOCs. We had a getting started TOC, and we had an HTML TOC. Into the getting started TOC, we only put sort of the general introduction type topics. None of the detailed topics. They only wanted those in the HTML site. In the HTML TOC, we put all of the topics. That was the comprehensive site. And so you can see I've reused topic 1 and 2 in both the TOC, the Getting Started TOC and the HTML TOC. Because they wanted 2 different outputs, the Getting Started PDF and the HTML, we had 2 different targets. I assigned the Getting Started TOC, of course, to the Getting Started PDF target, and the HTML TOC to my HTML target. And when I built these targets and generated the output, of course, I got my Getting Started PDF with just topic 1 and topic 2, and then I got my comprehensive HTML target with all of the topics included in it. Very, very handy. Very nice to be able to use multiple TOCs and be able to reuse your topics in different formats, different configurations, however it is that you need them to be used to meet the demands of your client or of your audience. Okay, so that is what I wanted to cover with single sourcing. Now, one of the topics that I said I would cover, and I don't have a specific slide for it, is multiple targets. But I think walking through all these examples, you kind of get the idea of the value of multiple targets and how they can be used. Another really great thing about multiple targets is you can use totally different style sheets and different skins. You can create 2 sites that or 2 PDF guides out of the same content that have a completely different look and feel. that was very handy when one of the clients I had in San Francisco, they sell a product to customers who resell that product with their own branding. And my client wanted to provide documentation to his customers, but the documentation that he provided needed to follow his customers' branding. So we were able to create all of the content in topics, and then using different targets with different style sheets and different skins and so forth, we're able to create the different look and feel that his customers wanted without having to go redo all of the content every time. So there's some really, as you can see, and you can start combining some of these single sourcing features in really, really neat and creative and innovative ways to meet the needs that you have. All right, let's move on, and I want to touch on multi-channel publishing. I want to make sure I leave enough time for some questions here at the end, so let's get through this. What is multi-channel publishing? Well, essentially multi-channel publishing allows you to publish your documentation output to many different formats from a single Flare project. We've already seen some of that in some of the single sourcing examples that I've just walked through. The previous one, for example, we had a PDF output and we had an HTML output. I've listed the output types there that Flare version 9 supports. You can see there's quite a few of them. In my experience, HTML5 is the most common. PDF is also very common. I see quite a bit of Word output. Recently, I've been seeing more EPUB and mobile requests. And Flare supports all of those, and I can create all of those, those output types from a single Flare project. Again, you create the content once, and then at very little incremental cost, you can deliver to all of these, different output types. The cost really is just how much time it takes you to set up the style sheet and that sort of thing that you want to make that output format look attractive and good in the format that you need to deliver it in. So again, how do you do it? Well, in Flare you can create multiple targets, as we've discussed, and you can designate the output type for each target. And you can also create style sheet mediums that apply only to a specific output format, which allows you, of course, then to customize the look and feel for each output type. So let me go through another example here. This one we just finished with a customer in Florida. They had they wanted a policy and procedure guide. They had roughly, I don't know, 70 or so standalone policy and procedure documents that were all Word files, and they wanted to combine them, and they wanted 4 different output types. They wanted one HTML site, which is kind of their primary, their primary repository. They also wanted an EPUB file, but they also wanted Word and PDF documents for each policy, not a single guide of, a single printed guide for Word and PDF of all the policies, but standalone versions of each policy. So it'd be like 70 of them. So here we go. We started again by creating Flare topics for each one of the policies. Again, there are roughly 70 of them. Again, we start here with the backbone and the foundation of what creates any documentation project, the content. Got that in place. We then built our TOC by inserting the topics into the TOC and defining their hierarchy. We then created targets. And again, we have 4 targets. We had our HTML5, we had our EPUB, PDF, and Word. So 4 different targets, 4 different multi-channel publishing targets. I inserted that same TOC into each of the targets. So there were not various TOCs, not multiple TOCs in this particular example. It was all the same TOC, all the exact same topics, the exact same content in every target. From there, and this may be a touch out of order, I kind of work on the style sheet sort of at the same time that I create the topics in Flare, just to know kind of how they're looking and things like that. But I, finalized, started creating, putting the finishing touches to the style sheet. Now let me walk through this really quick. This box represents my CSS file. The blue section here represents default styles. In other words, those are styles that are going to apply to every single target. Now in this particular case, I needed to make some specific EPUB styles, and I needed to make some specific print styles. So within the style sheet, I created an EPUB medium, and I created a print medium. Again, there will be a video of how I do this, how I did this after if you want to go watch it. Now for example, when I built the HTML5 target, it picked up the default styles because that's what I had specified the HTML5 target to do, and it built us our website with our policy documents. When I built the EPUB target, it picked up the default styles and then picked up extra EPUB specific styles that I needed to show up in my EPUB file and generated my EPUB output. In this particular case, they were using iBooks on iPad is what they had, so we built an EPUB file that worked there. That same concept applies, of course, to the PDF and to the Word targets. In this particular case, I set them both up to use the print medium because they're both print outputs. I could have done them separately if I needed to, but I didn't need to. So they picked up the default styles, then any specific print styles, including overriding default styles if necessary. And we had, again, our 70 standalone PDF files and our 70 standalone Word files. So at the end of this project, all from one source, from one set of topic files from one TOC, we ended up with an HTML5 site, an EPUB file, 70 PDF files, and 70 Word files. And we created a batch target that allowed the customer to run all of these at the same time. They don't have to do them independently. Again, I could have made one big PDF file or one big Word file that included all of the policies, but that's not what the customer wanted or needed. So you can start to see how powerful multi-channel publishing can be, and how when you do steps 1 and 2 properly and get that content in place, moving through steps 3, 4, and 5 can go very quickly and can add a lot of value to what you're able to deliver without having to spend a whole lot of time or extra money or effort to get these different output formats. Finally, let me walk through collaborative authoring. I don't think there's very many of us these days that just work completely in a silo and don't collaborate with other people. Collaborative authoring simply is the ability for multiple authors, subject matter experts, and editors to work together on the same content. There's a couple things that I want to talk about here. First, I'm going to touch on MadCap Contributor and a couple of the workflows there, and then we're going to talk about binding to source control, and I'll describe the different situations that you would use for these different capabilities. So MadCap Contributor. One of the things that you can do with MadCap Contributor very smoothly is manage content reviews. So here I've got an author, which is me, and a reviewer over on the right side of the page. The author would first create the topics and draft all the content in Flare, just like we've been seeing. Once that's done, I can create a review package in Flare, and I can send that review package to the reviewer. Now, if the reviewer has MadCap Contributor installed, which she should, she's able to take that review package and add annotations and edit the content using MadCap Contributor. Now, I should say here there's a free version of MadCap Contributor which allows the reviewer to add annotations. The full version allows the user to both add annotations and edit content and write content. So she goes through all that, makes her changes, makes her edits, in the files that I sent her using MadCap Contributor, and when she's done, she sends the review package back to me. And I get all of these edited Flare topics, and I, as the author, at that point can go through all these, and I can choose either to accept or reject the changes that my reviewer made. Again, this reviewer could be a fellow tech writer, it could be an SME, it could be an editor, it could be anybody that you imagine. And I, as the author, then get to accept or reject the changes that he or she proposes. That's how you can manage content reviews using Contributor. Let's look at how, using Contributor, you can allow other people to author new content so that you don't have to be the one to author the content all the time if your business requires that somebody else, that other people contribute. So what I would do, I as the author would create one or more what are called contribution templates. A template is exactly what you know a template is. So I would create a template and send that to my contributing author. And the contributing author would go through that template, add content, pictures, write up whatever needs to be in there, hyperlinks, and so on and so forth. And once she is done, she would send her draft Flare topics back to me. I can then take that content that she has created and import them into my Flare project. And that way I have my content. And I can then, of course, go back and do the other content review cycle if I needed to with another reviewer or whatever. But that's how MadCap Contributor manages content reviews and authoring new content on a collaborative basis. Now, this works really, really well if you're the only author and if you have other people that you need to work with, if you're the only tech writer. But what if you have a team of tech writers all with Flare installed who are collaborating on the same project? That's when binding to a source control server becomes extremely valuable. I like doing this so much, I typically bind to a source control server even when I am the only author. So in this example, we have 3 tech writers. All 3 of them need to collaborate on a single project. In this case, what we're going to do is we are going to bind our project to a source control server. So for this example, tech writer number 1 is going to open his project on his laptop in Flare, and he's going to bind that project to the source control server, either Subversion or Microsoft TFS. What that's going to do is send a copy of the project to the source control server, and it's going to create a link between the project on the writer's computer and on the source control server, such that anytime the writer opens his project and makes changes on his laptop, those changes will be replicated to the source control server. Now we got Tech Writer 2 and Tech Writer 3 who need to join the project and the team. So they open up their versions of Flare, and from Flare they import the project onto their laptops, the same project that Tech Writer 1 bound to the source control server. This does the same thing with their computers. It creates a link between their projects on their laptop and what is on the source control server. This way, all 3 of these writers can all contribute to this particular project. All 3 of them will know what each of the different writers are doing, which files they're working in, and that sort of thing. They will use the source control tab on the Flare user interface to manage, the files that they're checking in and checking out, so forth, from the source control server. Also, use this to get the latest version of all files. If say Tech Writer 1 has updated a file and Tech Writer 2 and Tech Writer 3 need to update that, they can come here and go get the latest version of all of the files. This way you have 3 tech writers in this particular example, all working on the same project, all contributing to it, and making sure that they're not running into conflicts and bumping into one another. They can see what each other is doing and can contribute to that project in a very smooth fashion. So in summary, we've talked about a bunch of single sourcing options. We've talked about multi-channel output. We've touched on a couple collaborative authoring practices. I hope that as we've talked through this, you've been able to get a vision or an idea of how you may be able to use some of these things in your own project, and to meet some of the requirements that your customers or your clients or your audience may have. The last thing I want to mention about Flare is, for me, it's flat out fun to use. I started using it, like I said, 18 months ago, and that was sort of a career revitalization for me because I thoroughly enjoyed working in this tool, and it made me look forward to getting back to work. The reason for that is because, like I said before, it put me in the driver's seat. It gave me the capability to deliver what my clients wanted, and it was fun to please my clients and to please my customers and to deliver what my audience needed. And I simply had a great time using it, and I think there's value in using a tool that you enjoy using, and I think Flare is a very fun one to use. If you have had any questions about anything that I've presented or want some more detail, here's my contact information. I'll leave this up as we do the Q&A, so you can write it down if you want to get in touch with me offline. I've had a very good time being here today. There's a couple things that I want to go through. First of all, coming up in April, the middle of April there, is the second annual Mad World Conference. I unfortunately didn't make it to the first one, but I'm signed up to go to the second one. I'm very, very excited about it. Everybody that I've talked to who went to Mad World last year have said that it's the best conference they've ever been to. That's not an exaggeration. Every person that I've talked to has said that. So if you're not signed up, take the chance now to go get signed up. There's the URL there. And secondly, for attending this presentation today, MadCap is offering you $100 off MadSkills training. So there's the discount code you need to go check out, go to the MadSkills site and check out the training that they have. I would highly recommend it. And you can use that discount code to get $100 off. These slides will be available for you after the fact, so you can have this information available after if you didn't quite catch it now. All right, we're only down to just a few minutes. I took a little bit longer than I anticipated, but maybe we can use these last 3 or 4 minutes for any questions. So David, have any questions come in?
Yes, we've got quite a few, so I will send you a couple, but thank you. That was an excellent presentation. We'll handle a few questions here, but then we'll put together a document with a Q&A so that all these questions can be answered, and we'll send that out either with the recording or a few days afterwards.
Okay.
So here's the first one.
Good question. So in my multi-channel publishing example, how did you get away with one target for all 70 Word and PDF outputs and you're using only one TOC? Let me show you how I did that. If I can get this, there we go. So let me just hurry and bring up a Word target here. In your Word target and in your PDF target, there's an option here. I think it's in advanced. Right here in MS Word output, generate multiple documents for MS Word output. What that will do when you have that selected is back here in your TOC, every time on one of your files that you select a chapter break, when it reaches that chapter break, it's going to start a new Word document, a whole new Word document. So for example, in this particular case, if I were to leave it set here, when I built my target, it would create a Word document for install ROS, and then it would start a whole new Word document for getting started with ROS, and it would continue with that Word document unless, I went through and set this one also to be a chapter break, in which case it would, start a new document then. So in that example, I had for every entry in my TOC, they had to be chapter breaks, and then when I had this selected in my target, it generated 70 different Word outputs. That's how that works. Same thing with PDF. And also in your TOC, you can manage how the page numbering should work. So you can have it reset to 1 every time. So so each standalone document has the correct page numbers on them. They all start with 1 and then end whenever they end. That's how I did that. Okay, next question. Regarding conditional text, why do you need to set both include and exclude? What is the default for output? If the default is to include everything, it would seem to me setting exclude would be enough. Yes, that is true. Let me open a target here, and let's have a look at this. So in this particular case, again, this is my Model A, Model B example. We've got include and exclude. The reason I did that for the example that I gave is, and let me pull this up, I think it was this file. I've got content tagged here, and that's represented by these different colors. For Model A is red and Model B is blue. Everything that is not a color is common content that's going to be included in all of my targets. This is just a silly example here, just to kind of show how it works. Of course, this isn't real content. So if I don't go into my target here, let's say this is my Model A target, and tell it specifically to exclude Model B stuff right there, then it's going to pick up all this blue stuff as well. By default, it's going to go get it. And so I need to tell it, if this is Model A, I don't want the Model B stuff in there. I need that excluded. But I also want to include, of course, all the Model A content. And so I specifically told them for those, for those two conditions, to include the Model A stuff and to exclude the Model B stuff. If I don't specify this, I believe by default that it's going to be included. And so you need to make sure you go exclude the stuff that you don't want in your output and include the stuff that you do want in it.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks again, Daniel. We are past the hour, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But like I said, we will put together a document with a Q&A so that everyone can get their questions answered. And again, if anyone has further questions, feel free to email Daniel, myself, or anybody at MadCap Software, and we'll get it taken care of.
Thanks, David.
Okay.